Amen. Well, I will say it is good to be back. It was also good to be away. I'm not going to lie to you about that. It was good. One of the benefits of taking some sabbatical time was that I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with my family. And that is something that definitely feeds my spirit. In the midst of this time with family, I spent a fair amount of my focus observing my son Thomas. Like all first-time parents, I imagine I am constantly amazed at watching him learn and grow and express his unique personality. It turns out that Thomas is something of an extrovert. Who would have guessed? And even though he seems to enjoy spending time with his mother and I, it seems like he enjoys that. He's reached that age. In fact, he reached that age as soon as he could walk, it seems like, when he at times simply prefers to be with other children, which is both a freeing experience for us because he goes off and, hey, we can do other things. And it's a little sad because, I like spending time with me. At the start of our sabbatical time together, the three of us took a 2-week cruise from Los Angeles to the Hawaiian Islands. And on the ship, they had a kids club. And the kids club was divided into 3 different age groups. There was the 3 to 7-year-olds, the 8 to 12-year-olds, and the 13 to 17-year-olds. And in the 3 to 7-year-old group, of which Thomas was a part, there were about 20 children. And in the span of 15 days on the ship, these 20 children became very good friends. But actually, it wasn't as if it took 15 days. Because the reality was that from the very beginning, they were friends. Even those they hadn't met yet were friends. There was this wonderful thing by about the 2nd or 3rd day on the cruise, Thomas would walk around as if he were the mayor of the ship, greeting everyone. He walked around saying, "Hey, Matthew. Hey, Jenny. Hey, friend," because he didn't know everyone's name, but everyone was his friend, and they became very close. Thomas, of course, more quickly than others, because Thomas also, surprisingly, is something of a hugger. We're working on the asking permission before you just randomly hug the stranger. We had one time when we met these 2 women in kind of the general area, and we talked to them for all of about 1.5 minutes before Thomas started hugging them, which was lovely. And they both looked at us kind of like, "Whoa, he's friendly." This experience for us was not unique to the ship, for Thomas has made some wonderful friends and expressed these qualities at his 2 churches and at school. And I'll tell you what, I went in life from being Mark to being Elena's husband. Now I am Thomas's father, and that's not a bad deal. In the midst of all these settings, though, these fast friendships did not go without some disagreement. But even those disagreements were very quickly forgotten, and the friendships were reestablished, perhaps stronger. So based on all of this observation, I think that this tendency for our children to so quickly become friends and to see in each person a potential friend, it leads me to believe that the idea of enemies and having enemies is something we have to learn. It's not natural. It seems that we learn over time how to have enemies. And my friends, we do it very well. As we determine who we are, we have a tendency to define ourselves over and against the thems of the world. For me to be who I am, they have to be who they are. In the wider culture, in our personal lives, perhaps we no longer even hear friendly language associated with our enemies or those on the other side. We used to hear in political debates, people use phrases like, my worthy opponent. We don't hear that anymore. We just hear damnation and condemnation. And now, even with one disagreement, we have learned this so well that we become enemies with others. As if someone expresses an opinion different than ours and we find ourselves standing like Captain Kirk looking at them and saying, Khan! They're so evil because they don't agree with us. In some cases, alliances can be rebuilt around a new common idea, perhaps a new common enemy, but those alliances are really tentative. For the next time we disagree, they'll be enemies again. And at other times, our disagreements are so core to our values that these folks are our enemies for life with no chance of anything else. And my friends, this is something that our children learn from us. And given their predisposition to acceptance and friendship, that is really a shame. Today's passage in the gospel is one of those especially challenging passages, perhaps one we would prefer to simply set aside. Generally, we're pretty good when we hear Jesus talking about the story of the Good Samaritan and end with the note of love your neighbor, and that's great and wonderful, and we can do that. But love your enemies? What is Jesus thinking? If we pause for a moment and think about the first people who would have heard this story from Jesus or from Luke's writing, imagine them hearing this. Love your enemies, which for them meant love the Pharisees, love the Sadducees, love the Romans, love those who are persecuting you and killing your friends. How do we love them? It seems impossible. And if I am correct that the idea of having enemies is something that we've learned, then Jesus is essentially, in this time, encouraging us to unlearn. There's a wonderful passage also in the Gospels when Jesus, while holding a child, implores the people, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I wonder if this might be a piece of that message. We may need to step back, or 2 steps back, or 10 steps back, and unlearn and reacquaint ourselves what it means to see potential friends in each person. In today's reading, Jesus introduces what biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann calls the 4 abrasive imperatives: to love, to do good, to bless, and to pray for the enemies who harm us. And it is quite likely when we have dug our heels so deeply in that these imperatives seem impossible. Perhaps in an effort to unearth our feet just a little bit, we might take a step back and rather than seeing them as imperatives, look upon them as possibilities. We could ask ourselves, what might the world be like if we could pray for our enemies, do good for our enemies? What might the world be like? While I was on sabbatical, I spent time reading a book that had been given to me by Rabbi Kalev of Congregation Tikvat Jacob. He and I had begun to talk a little bit about the situation in Israel and Palestine. And he sent me a book called Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor by Yossi Klein Halevi. He wrote in a note, it said something like, this book captures my feelings beautifully. So I spent time reading this book, and Halevi is a naturalized citizen of Israel. He was born in the United States and moved to Israel. He served in the Israeli army in the border region with Palestine. And throughout the book, he describes his his evolution of thought about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. And he goes through various stages in his progression of thought. And he expresses over and over again his frustration over the lack of progress in this conflict. And I think we all know that that is both frustrating and frightening for our world. And where he lands is on the decision to simply write this book, to write and share his story and his perspective, but to do so as an invitation to an unnamed Palestinian neighbor to do the same. He shares his story in the hopes that one on the other side of the conflict, who would be naturally an enemy, but whom he refers to as neighbor, might do the same and share their story. He's not telling us that we have to agree, for we know that the perspectives on this centuries-old conflict do not align. He's not telling us that we have to abandon our perspective. But we come to the point of being enemies when our words or actions serve to minimize or invalidate the story or personhood of another. And Halevi is attempting to overcome that in this conflict. And I'll tell you, it takes courage to share one's story with someone who is not of like mind. It takes courage to put ourselves out there, knowing that what we say may be rejected. But if we can find that courage, and if we can find a way to hear and understand one another's stories, and to affirm the presence of another's story, perhaps we can move away from the brink. Perhaps we might begin to see a neighbor where we previously saw an enemy. I want to take a step back, though, to Jesus' message for a moment. These four abrasive imperatives: to love, to do good, to bless, to pray for the enemies who harm us. I would point out that we are not called, again, to abandon our perspective or allow ourselves to be abused or minimized. We are called to act from a place of love as we reach out, recognizing that true connection will require reciprocation. Ultimately, it must be mutual. But the reality is it has to start somewhere. In the lectionary, this passage from Luke is paired this week with the story, a part of the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And it's the part of the story of Joseph where it's toward the end, where his brothers are standing before him asking for his help. He has set up his brother Benjamin as the thief, and he is now standing before his brothers in this moment that he reveals himself as their brother Joseph. And if anyone ever had a righteous beef with another, Joseph did. For these are the brothers, if you will recall, who had beaten him up, who had sold him into slavery, who had told their father that he was dead. If anyone ever had reason to look upon someone as an enemy, Joseph had cause. And yet in this moment, knowing his story and seeing in the eyes of his brothers what they had gone through, seeing in the eyes of his brothers their story that brought them to this place, Joseph moves away from anger and hatred and is moved by compassion and love. and he reaches out, and they meet him in that moment. They go from being enemies to once again being brothers. A couple of weeks back, after we were back in town from our travels, Elena and Thomas and I went to dinner. And we ran into a couple folks we knew who were on their way to see the Distinguished Speaker event featuring James Comey. And after some initial introductions, they pointed out to us that these two people who were going to this event stood on opposite sides when it came to this political issue in our world. And after we went and sat at our table, and I eavesdropped a little bit, I'll admit, I heard one of them say, "Do you still want to ride together?" And the answer was yes. And I'll tell you what, in a situation where disagreement, which we see in our wider culture, can set us apart as enemies and adversaries, what we witnessed was friendship. The willingness to dine together, to attend an event together, and to even, after all had been said and done, to ride back in the same car. It's powerful. More powerful than I think you know. Because what it represents for me is an expression of hope. Because friendship can trump our disagreements. It can push us past that which divides us. Friendship can help us even with those we disagree with. See a neighbor, see a friend, and invite us into even deeper relationship if we are willing to take that step. I invite us in the weeks to come, when we are faced with one with whom we disagree, to perhaps reach out with a story that they might understand where you're coming from. Reach out with open ears to hear their story, that you might understand from where they come. And perhaps, rather than leaving as enemies, you might leave as neighbors and friends. Amen.